Hi, in this video we're talking about Angular directives, and specifically we're talking about structural directive ngFor, what we use it for and how we use it. Let's look at the definition for directives. If you Google Angular directives and go to the official Angular documentations, you can see this definition that would say directives are classes that add additional behavior to elements in your Angular applications. And we are talking about built-in directives. If you scroll down, you can see three types of directives: components, attribute directives, and structural directives. We are looking at structural directives, and here it says structural directives change the DOM layout by adding and removing DOM elements. If you're not familiar with DOM notion, let's look at it. Let's Google DOM web development. The very first link is actually a really good website with a lot of good references. Let's go there. DOM stands for the Document Object Model, and the very first definition that you can see is that the DOM is the data representation of the objects that comprise the structure and content of a document on the web. This definition sounds a little bit complicated. The idea behind DOM is actually really simple. DOM represents a tree of elements that the browser displays to us as a page. So when we see a web page, we see images, text, icons, and the browser actually sees the tree of those elements. Let's Google the same thing, but now go to images, and let's click on one of the first images that pop up. Here you can see that we have a root element HTML that has two children, head and body, and those children are parents to other elements nested inside of them. So why DOM? Why don't we call it just a tree of elements? We call it Document Object Model because the information about all these elements on the web page and how they're related to each other are being stored in this JavaScript object document. And we as developers can actually access this document object and look at all elements comprising this document. Let's go back to our application and look at it. You can press F12, or you can go to this menu, More Tools, Developer Tools, and make sure you're on the console, right here. And here you can type document, press Enter, and here we can see this document object with all the elements inside of it. Let me minimize it. You can do the same thing from your application. Let's go to our home component.ts file, and inside this ngOnInit method, we can console log our document object. I'm gonna save it, Ctrl S. And as you can see, I can access this document object programmatically. What is also great about this document object, it allows us to access every single element of the page and not just access it. We can manipulate it, we can delete them from the DOM, or we can add new elements to the DOM. Let's look at the example. First, let's look at the properties and methods of this document object. If we Google document methods JavaScript and click on the first link, we'll be able to see the list of all properties and methods of this object. Let's use one of the methods, getElementById. Let's go back to our application, and here let's give this paragraph a random ID. I'm gonna call it test ID, and now we're gonna use our getElementById method to access this paragraph element. Let me save it, Ctrl S. Here in the console, I'm gonna type document dot getElementById, and in parentheses, in quotation marks, I'm gonna put my ID. Let's press Enter. And as you can see, we can access our paragraph using this method. Now let's access this text that's inside our paragraph. I'm gonna type the same thing, and I'm actually gonna press arrow up to access the last command, and I'm gonna put that in HTML, and I'm gonna press Enter. And of course I misspelled it. Let me fix it. One more time. As you can see, we can access the text inside the paragraph. What's even better, we can actually change the text programmatically. So let me get the same command, arrow up, and I'm gonna say equal, and I'm gonna say hello. Press enter. And here on the page, as you can see, our text changed to hello. Now that we know what DOM is and what it actually means, we can go back to our Angular directives. Angular docs gives us 3 different types of Angular directives. The first one is component directives. As you remember, we created those components, and inside our app component HTML, we assembled our page. And one of them was component app navbar. By adding this component to this file, we change the structure of the page we are going to be displaying. So we change the DOM, and that's why Angular considers components directives, because they're changing the DOM of the page that is being displayed. Next type is attribute directives. Those directives change the appearance or behavior of a specific element. The last type listed here is structural directives, and those directives change the DOM layout by adding and removing DOM elements. And this is what we're gonna do with our ngFor directive. If we click on this link, structural directives, we will get to this built-in structural directives page. One of the common built-in structural directives is ngFor. Let's look at it. This is the basic structure of the ngFor structural directive. Let's see an example how it works. Let's go back to our application. Let me remove this ID and type, well, we start with a star, ngFor equal let item of items. So what we are doing here, we are going to repeat this paragraph for as many elements as we have in this list. Let's create this list in a TS file. I'm gonna call it my array, and I'm gonna declare it as a array, and I'm going to initialize with a few items inside. Let's put a few strings in there, and it's gonna be names. And I'm gonna put string in here, so Angular knows what kind of array I have. I'm gonna save it, Control S. And I'm gonna go back to my home component HTML. And instead of items, I'm gonna type my array. Control S. And let's look at our application. Let me close the developer tools. So as you can see, this paragraph element was recreated 4 times. And that's because this array has 4 elements. Right here. Now, instead of displaying the same string, home works, let's display all these names on the screen. When ngFor directive goes through this array, it extracts every element out of the array into this variable item. You can call it anything you want, it doesn't have to be item. Let's rename it to something else. Let's just call it I. Let me save it. Nothing changed here, but now here we're gonna use a string interpolation syntax, double curly braces, and inside I'm gonna put this I element. Let me save it, Control S. And as you can see, we have all these names on the screen. Now, if you're coming from a different programming language, this ngFor directive might remind you a structure of a for each element. In C# language, this for each string looks pretty similar to this structure. Now we can use this directive for any element in a DOM. The most common case, we use it as lists and tables. For example, let's create an unordered list, and inside that list we're going to have a list item. I'm going to press enter, and inside this list item I'm going to use this string interpolation syntax. I'm going to just copy and paste it there. And inside the list item tag, I'm gonna use this ngFor directive. Let me save. And let's look at our application. So now, as you can see, we have a list of 4 items. Now let's take a next step and let's display that complicated JSON object we got from a remote server in our previous video. Let me close these 2 pages. And let me open our context page. We're gonna go to our TS file. Here in our context component TS file, we call the service that we created. And this service accessed this website and gave us data in a JSON format. At this point, we are not displaying it, but we can see it in our console. Let me go to our context page. And this is the data we received in a JSON format. Let's display this data on the screen. When you have an array of objects and you want to display the data on the screen, you often use a table structure. Since we are using Bootstrap to style our application, let's go to the Bootstrap website and grab syntax for a table. In the content part, I can see tables. Let me scroll down and let me just grab the very first one. I can click to copy here. I'm gonna go back to my application. Let me go to our context component HTML. I'm gonna leave it alone there. I'm gonna just put a line under it. And here I'm gonna place that markup we just copied. Ctrl V. Let me save it. Ctrl S. And let's look at our application. Let me close the developer tools for now. And let's adjust this table to display our JSON data. I will create a global variable right here on the export class. And I'm gonna call it people with type any. And on line 19, I'm gonna put that data we received from our service into that variable people. This people equals result. I'm gonna save it, Ctrl S. Let's go back to our HTML file. And instead of hard coding all these 4 table rows, we're gonna just leave 1 table row. Let me remove these ones. And we're gonna use our syntax for ngFor directive. Let me go to the Angular documentation and copy, Ctrl C, and paste it to our application. Right here. Now I need to replace this item with people. Let me remove this and this. So here we have just 3 headers and 3 columns. Let me just save it and see what happens to our application. Ctrl S. And as you can see, we have a table, but we don't have any data. Let's open our developer tool. And here, if we expand it, we can see that we have object info and we have an array of objects, results. To access this array of results, we're gonna use dot notation. So what it means, we're gonna put dot here and we're gonna type results. Let me save it. As you can see, our table row got duplicated 10 times. Now let's change this hard-coded strings and pull the data from our JSON string. And to find the first and last name, let's look again at the structure of our object. I'm gonna go inside the results array and I'm gonna go into the first item, click name, and we have first and last name. To access the first and the last name, I'm gonna use the dot notation again, and I'm gonna be actually using this item variable that we are creating. And this item is gonna be an object inside this array. So let me replace mark with item dot name dot first. Let me do the same thing for the last name. I'm gonna copy paste it here. And let's also extract the country of the person. Let's go to location, and inside coordinates we have this country property. So instead of typing name, we're gonna type location dot coordinates dot country. Let me save it and see what happens. The reason I'm seeing this because I didn't use the string interpolation syntax. So let's fix it really quick. Let's save it, Control S. I can see the first and the last name, but I don't see the country. Let's look at the problem. I need to go inside the location. And instead of going to coordinates, I can actually go directly to the country. Control S. And now we can see the list as expected. Now we see this error on the screen. The reason for that error is because we are placing our code inside our ngOnInit method. And as you remember from our video about this method is being called after the template or HTML page is already constructed. So when Angular is constructing this page, they are trying to access these items and they just can't find it. It throws an error here, but after the page is constructed, this method is being called and all this data is being displayed on the screen. So how can we fix this error? What you can do to fix this error, instead of creating this variable of type any, you can create an array of objects. And object you're gonna create in a separate file. Let's do it really quick. Inside our app folder, I'm gonna create a folder, models. And inside our folder models, I'm gonna create a file, %ts. To make it available to other classes in our application, I have to put export, class, and the name of the class. Let's call it person. Inside our class, I'm gonna create a few properties. Let's call it first name, and it's gonna be a string, last name, and country, also string. We're going to create a constructor and we will initialize those strings. And when we say initialize, we're going to assign them initial values. So our first name, and because it belongs to this class, we have to put this word, first name, empty string, and same for the other ones. Let's save it. And now let's use this class in our contact component TS file. Instead of using people variable of type any, we're going to change it to an array of objects, person, and it's going to be an empty array. Now we need to import this class, quick fix, and as you can see we have this line. I'm gonna save, Control S, and now we have an error here, and it's because this person class doesn't look at all like our JSON we used before. Let's create a method that will grab the data from the JSON file and populate our new array. Let's make some space and create a method where we'll populate our array. I will call it populate array, parentheses, curly braces, and it will have a parameter. Let's call it result, type any, and here we're gonna call this method. So it's gonna be this populate array, and we're gonna send this result object to that method. Now inside this method, we're going to use a for each block, and here we need to put our array. And as you remember, to access our array, we need to use this result object, and inside we had an array of objects, and the name was also results. First thing, we're going to create an instance of that class. Person equals. After that, we can access the properties of that person's object. So if I type person dot, and here I can see all properties of this object. First name, element, and as you remember, we can use the first name using the dot notation. I'm gonna copy it, semicolon. I'm gonna do the same thing for the last name, and I'm gonna do the same thing for the country. Let me see why I have an error here. And I need to put it in parentheses. And after I created this object and assign all properties, I can add it to the array I created. Is people, and we're gonna use the push method. So my method is done, and let's look at it one more time. So from here, I'm going to call my method, and I'm gonna send that JSON object that we got from the service. And here, for each object in the array, I'm going to create a new object of type person, and I'm going to assign this first, last name and country properties to this new created object. After I did it, I'm gonna push this object to our array we created earlier right there. Now let me save it. And let's go to our HTML file. And instead of using people.results array, I have an array that I created. And the name of that array is people. Here I have to change it to, because we are not accessing our JSON. Let's save it and let's look at our application. We have the same results, but let's look at our console. As you can see, the error is gone. I hope this video was helpful and thank you for watching.